Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Iran is again in the news for all the wrong reasons. Last Thursday, Iran's foreign minister tweeted, and I'm quoting from the tweet, instead of fighting COVID in US at real Donald Trump and cohorts waste billions to fly B-52s and send armadas to our region. Intelligence from Iraq indicate plot to fabricate pretext for war. Iran doesn't seek war, but will openly and directly defend its people's security and vital interests, unquote. Zarif's remarks followed the presence of two US B-52 bombers in the region last week and an aircraft carrier redeployed to the Indian Ocean. Iraq has been a theater for both direct and proxy clashes between Tehran and Washington. 1 year ago, a US drone assassinated the powerful Iranian general Qasem Soleimani just outside Baghdad airport. Iran retaliated with ballistic missile strikes at US bases in central Iraq and the northern city of Erbil. Meanwhile, the European Union has warned Iran against enriching uranium to 20%, a move announced by Iran. Iran, on its part, has rejected European criticism. At a press conference on Tuesday, Iran's government spokesperson said Iran's announcement on Monday that it has started enriching uranium to a purity of 20% is fully in line with legislation mandated by Parliament and Article 36 of the 2015 nuclear deal. In another move, Iranian judiciary spokesman Ghulam Hussain Szmuely announced during a press conference on Tuesday that Iran has requested Interpol to arrest Trump and 47 other American officials identified as playing a role in the assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani last year. This is the second Iranian request for an international arrest warrant for Trump and dozens of US officials in the Pentagon and US Central Command, among other organizations. Let's now get to our panel and try to unpack these developments. I'm joined by Tohid Assadi, a PhD candidate of American Studies at the University of Tehran, and George Szmuely, Senior Research Fellow, Global Policy Institute, and author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. Right, so let's get to the chase here, starting with Mr. Assadi here. Mr. Assadi, let's go in the reverse order. Let's start with this Interpol red warrant. What exactly does it mean? Is this just symbolic? Is Iran really serious about it? What's going on?
There are a couple of points about this warning, and the first and maybe the most important of which I can refer to is the very fact that this international community-oriented system is not that much capable, considering some tangible facts on the ground. We know that Trump and his administration is responsible for a number of criminal activities, most outstanding of which I can refer to the clear instance of state terrorism, which took place just nearly one year ago when Qasem Soleimani, Iranian top general, was assassinated by the direct, let's say, order of the US president. It is a clear instance of state terrorism. And the list goes on and on and on, including but not limited to Trump's direct orders for the United States to withdraw from international deals and other, let's say, courses of action that he has done illegally in order to put pressure upon Iran. And I think legally, Iran has got this right to send this warning. But the truth of the matter is that when it comes to international bodies and international organizations, this criticism always runs out there that there is a lack of commitment and there is a lack of sustainable system that could address such issues. And I think in this instance, there is going to be a repetition of the same criticism directed towards the matter. It is not limited to, let's say, such warnings. It is also related to Iran's pursuits in international communities like, say, Security Council to address its rights. But knowing the fact that the United States has got kind of, let's say, pressure directed towards these organizations, yes, part of this treatment, part of this course of action taken by Iran could be considered symbolic.
Right.
Just giving
okay, I get the thrust of your argument. Unfortunately, or fortunately, perhaps, there's no world governments or international law, and some of these organizations obviously are hampered by issues of sovereignty and consent. But let me pull in George Szmuely here. George Szmuely, let's talk about the 20% enrichment, uranium enrichment. Now, the European Union, as I said in my opening, is pretty concerned about it, and they feel that this is going to violate the JCPOA, whereas Iran is saying, well, this is completely in line with the JCPOA. So give me your reading of this.
Well, it's in line with the JCPOA in that once the United States withdrew from the JCPOA and once the United States imposed sanctions on Iran and made them, the sanctions extraterritorial, and the European partners on the JCPOA either were unable or unwilling to do anything to alleviate the pain of the reimposition of sanctions on Iran. Once all that happened, Iran was within its rights under the JCPOA to do what it has done, which is to withdraw step by step from its commitments under the JCPOA. And this is entirely in accord with all of the steps that it has taken since 2018. The Europeans aren't really in any position to complain because they haven't done what they said that they would do. I mean, what incentive does Iran have to adhere to its commitments, to adhere to its essentially self-abnegation, giving up on its nuclear enrichment program, if it doesn't get anything out of it? I mean, why would anyone continue with an agreement from which it gets nothing out of? I mean, that's why Iran entered into the JCPOA. That's why Iran gave up on nuclear enrichment, because it expected in return the end of the sanctions. It hasn't happened. So it's understandable entirely that Iran is now moving ever further away from the JCPOA. And I suspect that the JCPOA is simply a dead letter. I mean, it's just history. There's nothing really to salvage anymore.
That's a very interesting point. I'll return to you on this because there is an argument, and I think we've had this discussion before on this program with reference to the incoming Biden administration and how Biden might ease up some of these sanctions and allow the Europeans to take the lead, even if he doesn't go back into the JCPOA. But let's get back to that later. Let me bring in Mr. Assadi here on another point, which is with reference to the war scenario, with Tehran saying, well, most probably Trump is likely to do something violent before he leaves Oval Office. And as I said, the Iranian foreign minister talked about intelligence coming in. Now, Mr. Assadi, tell me, when Iran says that it doesn't want war, but it will retaliate, what kind of capabilities, if you will, is Iran relying on with reference to that kind of retaliation?
From a strategic point of view, I think there are a couple of points which should be seriously considered. First of all, when Iran says that it does not want any war, there is a hard evidence behind it, historically speaking, and that dates back to the history of Iran, in which you don't see even one single instance of the country in its contemporary history attacking the soil of any other country. But then again, getting back to this, let's say, argument raised by Iranian officials, well, there are a couple of other points. First, regionally speaking, we know that the United States is being sponsored by a couple of regional partners. So this is just one direct message that Iran has got to regional neighbors. The basis of Iran's regional foreign policy is on peace and stability in the region, simply because of the fact that Iran is located in the region, and stability of the region would be definitely for the benefit of the country. But if the United States tries to implement and use some regional basis in order to attack Iran's soil, then the response would be quite easy to expect. And that's going to be retaliation. And I think Iran is going to have kind of full-fledged retaliation using its own military capabilities. And we know that over the 4 decades that we had so far, seeing the sanctions implemented upon Iran, the country has been able to develop its own nuclear, its own, let's say, defense capabilities, not in nuclear form, despite what the Western side argues, but in a very...
So basically you're saying that Iran does have those capabilities to retaliate. And of course, as I mentioned in my opening also, after Major General Qasem Soleimani's assassination, Iran launched ballistic missile strikes on 2 U.S. bases. Thank you so much. That was Tohid Assadi speaking with us. George Szmuely, back to what I was saying with reference to the point you made, that JCPOA, for all practical purposes, is dead. So, I was kind of arguing from another perspective. So give me your thoughts on why you're taking this, I would say, somewhat extreme position on the demise of JCPOA.
Because there is really very few voices within the United States to re-enter the JCPOA. Many people had expected this from Vice President Biden, should he become president, though, that he would do this for no reason other than that he was a member of the Obama administration. But Biden is his own man. And Biden has always instinctively been a neoconservative, a neoliberal, whatever. He's always been a foreign policy hawk. And there's no real interest on his part to do something that would antagonize much of the foreign policy establishment within Washington, that would antagonize the very powerful Israel lobby within his own party. Remember, Chuck Schumer, who may well soon be the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer had voted against the JCPOA back in 2015. So what's the incentive for Biden to re-enter the JCPOA and to antagonize all of these powerful forces at a very early stage within his administration? And that's why he's given no real indications that he intends to re-enter it, other than talking vaguely about, well, we'll do it if Iran comes into compliance. But of course, Iran is into compliance.
I get you, and George Szmuely. I mean, I was thinking more in terms of Biden not really re-entering the JCPOA, but kind of easing up on sanctions and supporting the European Union members of the agreement to kind of get Iran to retrace its steps back. But stay with me, George. I'm also joined by David Herszenhorn, who's Chief Brussels Correspondent, Politico Europe. Mr. Herszenhorn, thank you for being with us. So you're talking about, Iran once again being in the news for all the wrong reasons. Of course, the Iranian foreign minister talking about the US B-52 bombers and the aircraft carrier, and then this whole talk of possible violent act by the United States somewhere in Iraq, and then Iranian retaliation. Then, of course, there's the problem of the 20% uranium enrichment. So give us an overview of where do you think the situation is going? Just unpack it for us.
Well, what we've seen in these last months, of course, is Joseph Borrell, the foreign policy chief of the European Union, who is actually responsible for the dispute resolution provisions within the JCPOA, doing his very best to run the clock, to delay and postpone in hope that there would be a new U.S. administration and they could keep the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, alive. That process played out well for him. Obviously, Joe Biden's victory gives hope to reviving and resuscitating the Iran nuclear deal. Now, following up on some of George's comments there, I think we do have some clearer signals now from the Biden administration about their intentions. Not only has Jake Sullivan been tapped to be the National Security Advisor, who was a key player in the negotiations over the JCPOA, but Wendy Sherman, who was a lead negotiator for the Americans, a huge supporter of the JCPOA, has now been tapped to become the Deputy Secretary of State. So we know that Joe Biden himself was a supporter of the deal. I agree there are problems potentially in the U.S. Congress, but there's every indication that the Biden administration does want to work with the E3, with Germany, the UK, and France, and Russia and China to get a deal back on track. Obviously, from their perspective, that requires a resumption of compliance by Iran with its commitments, and I'm not sure that we will see Tehran so readily interested in doing that. The 20% enrichment move was obviously a signal to Biden, to everyone, to say that Iran's return cannot be taken for granted any more than the Americans' return to the agreement. The very strong message from Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, saying that their steps are reversible if there's full compliance by other participants in the JCPOA. So we see quite a lot of maneuvering here on all sides. The European Union clearly hoping that they will be able to work with the Biden team and get this agreement back on track. But we also know from Jake Sullivan's comments in the U.S. that any discussion about resuscitating the JCPOA will then move quickly to talks about Iran's ballistic missile program. Not clear, again, if Tehran is willing to engage on that front. Many critics of the JCPOA, including Chuck Schumer, who may now become the majority leader in the Senate if these elections in Georgia play out as we expect. Schumer and others very much criticized the JCPOA in its development, in part because it did not address Iran's ballistic missile program and further meddling, if you want, we'll call it that, by Iran in the region. And so those issues will come back up as the Biden administration takes office, but I think they will quickly look to see if there are possibilities of getting the JCPOA back on track.
Very interesting points. My own sense is that as far as the ballistic missile program is concerned, and also as far as the Iranian realpolitik in the greater Middle East region is concerned, those are things that Iran is not going to talk about. And interestingly, you've sailed very close to what George was also saying. But George, here's the thing. These 2 points, as I said, as far as Iran is concerned, are off the table. But equally, the Iranian economy is terribly hurting. So Iran will try and somehow get sanctions, reprieve, but would try to do so within the original framework of the JCPOA. Do you think that is possible? I understand from what you said earlier that that's probably not going to happen, and David is also saying that. But before I wrap up, give me your sense of that.
Well, that's the thing. What Iran would be expected to do is to go beyond the commitments that it had made under the JCPOA, the commitments that it had incidentally adhered to, and that the United States basically just gave up on, even though Iran was in full compliance. So now Iran would be expected to give up something as fundamental to its security, which is its ballistic missiles program, and again, without any guarantees that the United States will adhere to this agreement. I mean, the way it works is that you can have a second agreement once you've implemented the first agreement, but if you haven't implemented the first agreement, then you can't get a second agreement. So there's no real incentive on Iran's part to start making additional commitments to the ones it made earlier. There's also the other issue, which is Iran would expect the United States to lift sanctions. That's the first sign. I mean, there's no point in saying, oh, yeah, we'll go back to the JCPOA, and in the meantime, the United States makes no commitment on ending sanctions. So therefore, you'd have to say, what's the incentive for Iran if the sanctions remain in place and the United States is making additional demands that really go to the heart of Iran's security?
Right. I'm almost run out of time, but very quickly, David, a thought sort of experiment. If the European Union parties tell Iran that the U.S. is prepared to ease sanctions, but that would require that Iran also commit to certain other conditions. Is that going to play out, or do you think it's not going to cut?
The choice here really is one that is internal for Iran. At some point, the Iranian government and the Iranian people have to come to terms with the fact that the greatest risk and threat to their security is the fact that these sanctions persist, their economy is in trouble, and because they are seen as a rogue actor in the Middle Eastern region, not just by the United States, but by some of their closest neighbors who see Iran as, under its current government, as a destabilizing force. Until that changes, these sanctions will continue. There will be a tough conversation to be had. Obviously, the move that Iran can make is signaling a willingness to come to the negotiating table that it hasn't been willing to make so far. No question that, in fact, the U.S. Under Donald Trump stepped back from its own commitments. Absolutely a fair point. But, for example, in Belgium, we've just recently seen an Iranian diplomat on trial for a plot to blow up a meeting of Iranian political opposition groups in France just a couple of years ago. Those kinds of activities on European soil do not enamor the Europeans to the Iranian government in its current form. So there's some really tough conversations to be had in Tehran about what kind of a neighbor and a player it wants to be in the Middle East and on the global stage.
Right. Good morning with you. Thank you. That was David Herszenhorn. Thank you also to George Szmuely for his insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss China's combat readiness and its standoff with India. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. In our second segment tonight, we shall discuss China's combat readiness and the continued standoff between China and India at the line of actual control. Per a report in Xinhua, in his first signed order of the Central Military Commission in 2021, Chinese President Xi Jinping stressed strengthening military training in real combat conditions and the ability to win. She also said that PLA should use frontline frictions to polish troop capabilities, and training exercises should incorporate technology. Since she took over, China has seen fast-paced military modernization. The focus has been to move from a labor-intensive to a tech-intensive military and develop cyber and other capabilities like the use of artificial intelligence. Meanwhile, the standoff with India continues. Indian analysts believe that while the Ladakh standoff might get resolved, China's overall policy towards India is unlikely to change. Some Indian military experts also point to Chinese push towards Bhutan, with the PLA building infrastructure on both sides of the Amu-Chu, which is a river that could threaten the Indian Siliguri corridor on the eastern front. Let's get to our panel now. I'm joined by Victor Gao, an international relations expert. Mr. Gao is a director of the China National Association of International Studies and an executive director of Beijing Private Equity Association. I also have with me Dr. Kamran Bokhari, who's director of analytical development at the Center for Global Policy. Thank you to both my guests. Let me begin with Mr. Gao here. Mr. Gao, first about the Chinese military modernization. The U.S. is talking about it. China's neighbors, especially in the South China Sea, I have also voiced concern about Chinese military modernization, and they think that this is China's way of showing military muscle. So Give us a sense of what this modernization really means.
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, China is the big country with the largest population in the world. And also China is facing very difficult and challenging geopolitical situations. China has altogether 14 land border countries and 6 maritime neighboring countries. And as we can see from the deterioration in China-US relations, there is a lot of security challenge against China. Therefore, for China to beef up its national defense, it's mainly for defense purposes, for self-defense. And China has no desire to practice expansionism or hegemonism, for example. Therefore, I think there is no reason to worry about China's improved national defense capabilities. China, for many, many decades, did not have any aircraft carrier. Now China only has 2, compared with about a dozen controlled by the United States. So China's defense is purely for national defense rather than for any adventurism or aggressiveness against other countries.
Right. Let's so get the view of Dr. Kamran Bokhari before we proceed further with more specific issues. Dr. Kamran Bokhari.
So Ijaz, I heard my co-panelist, and my response is that, intent isn't what other nations go by. China shouldn't go by intent. The United States shouldn't go by intent. Nobody should. It goes by capability. And once there's a spike in capability, and a sharp one, as you mentioned earlier in your report regarding China's advancement on the military front, then obviously that will trigger a response, not just from the land-bordered countries, particularly India, which is, the second largest, most populous country in the world, but also from the United States, because the United States maintains security in the Indo-Pacific region. And then once there's capability, the question is, what are the intentions of the Chinese? So again, intent alone isn't something that we go by in the realm of geopolitics and strategic thinking and planning.
Right. Now, just a quick point with reference to the Chinese policy. We have the RCEP, which is now the largest trading bloc, and China is a central player in that. And then, of course, recently, Angela Merkel was the driving force behind the EU-China trade deal. So it seems that China is clearly signaling that it wants economic partnerships, it wants trade relations, and it wants connectivity. So is that not enough signal to say that China does not really intend any aggressive moves? Kamran Bokhari?
Look, I mean, obviously, when you look at the entire picture of Chinese behavior, it's clear that it's complicated, it's complex. China is not looking for a fight per se. But at the same time, once you naturally, without even inadvertently, expand and flex economic muscle, and then on top of that you build up military capability, then it inevitably leads to a situation of at least Cold War, if not at some point open clashes. So now we're seeing the shadowing of U.S. Naval armada going through the South China Sea, all through the Straits of Taiwan to the North Pacific. And so, that's just one example. If you look at what has happened on the China-India border, one asks the question, okay, on one hand, we have all these trade deals, and they tell us a different picture, but then there is this behavior that we can't ignore, if you will. Of course, it's low level at this point, but then military planning is all about the future. It's all long-range planning, and you move accordingly. And again, this isn't just the United States. China is doing the same thing, as my colleague from China just pointed out. That look, they're building up because they feel threatened. So in many ways, this is sort of the classic security dilemma.
Absolutely. I love it. Smell structural realism. This is, as Mersheimer said, the tragedy of great power politics. Mr. Gao, you heard Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Is there something you want to add to what he's saying in terms of the security dilemma and in terms of how it, even when unintended, signals something which is negative to the weaker countries?
No, I don't think so. First of all, I don't think there is a security dilemma. China is a big country. China is a very large country in terms of landmass, very complicated in terms of terrain, very complicated in terms of the number of neighboring countries, as I mentioned. China does not want to have a Cold War or an arms race with any other country. But in substance, China is not afraid of a Cold War or an arms race with any other country in the world. We simply don't want to have one. But if some country wants to impose an arms race on China or create a Cold War situation, it will be destructive. It will be bad for China, but also for the country which initiates the Cold War. I hope mankind will not live again through another Cold War or even a hot war, because that's bad for everyone in the world. I think in the world of today, maintaining peace and stability and devoting yourself to development and compete in a peaceful and amicable way in 5G, in technologies, etc. That's the right thing for all of us to do. And you cannot basically complain about China if China does better in terms of controlling the COVID-19 virus, or if China makes more and more breakthroughs in technological advances. I think in terms of the military capabilities China is building up, it is very much designed to protect China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, to make sure that no foreign country will ever even dream about having a military boot on the Chinese soil. And I think China will defend its national sovereignty, territorial integrity to the hilt. And all the Chinese people rally behind the Chinese government against any attempted invasion or aggression against China. That's the bottom line.
Right.
China does not have any desire against the foreign soils or territories in far-flung places.
I get you. I get the thrust of your argument, Gao. One quick question before I go back to Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Is China expecting some kind of easing of, the negativity that has dominated the relationship with the incoming President Biden administration?
Oh, yes. I think the days of the Trump administrations are really numbered. And Mr. Biden will be the president on January the 20th. This is very good news for the American people overall, as well as for the rest of the world. China will welcome Joe Biden as the president and deal with him as he is. And I hope both the Chinese leaders and the American leaders under Joe Biden will be more responsible in taking care of whatever challenges and issues there are in China-U.S. relations, and really do a better job in promoting constructive and normal relations, rather than, for example, having President Trump, who is like a spoiled brat, for example, in the highest position in the world, and completely disregards the fundamental interests of the American people, as well as peace and stability in the world. I hope the world will be a better world on and after January the 20th.
Right. Thank you. That was Victor Gao speaking with us. Kamran Bokhari. So it seems one thing is very clear. Now, China wants connectivity. China obviously says that it's a very powerful state, and it is. And it doesn't really necessarily want to be seen as an aggressor, but simultaneously, and notwithstanding this, it doesn't want to have its own Monroe Doctrine. And I think the area in which it wants to have that is also the area where the United States projects power and has projected power since the end of the Second World War. So it seems that that particular area is going to be the bone of contention.
Yes, and allow me to go back to Mr. Gao's point about China not having any designs or ambitions, extraterritorial ambitions. I can see that, but I think that isn't really what bothers Beijing. The buildup is about regime survival, because this is a peculiar regime, the Chinese Communist Party. It's a single-party state. And if we look at what is happening in Hong Kong, if we look at what's happening in Xinjiang, and what's been happening in Tibet and other parts of China, the biggest worry is a colored revolution, which is associated with U.S.-backed efforts at regime change. That's the worry of China. As it becomes bigger, it wants to strengthen itself at home. The best defense is offense. And so the buildup is not necessarily, I agree with Mr. Gao, that is to capture territory, whether on land or sea, but it's to prevent any effort at sort of destabilization of the regime. So to go back to your question, look, at the end of the day, as Mr. Gao pointed out, it's 2 versus a dozen aircraft carriers, if you want to take a metric. And sort of measure firepower on the high seas. So yes, the U.S. has the advantage, but this isn't something that's going to remain the same way. China does not want to stick to 2 carriers, and the United States needs to plan for that. What that means is inevitably there's going to be some form of confliction, if not conflict. If these trend lines continue, China continues to rise. And look, at the end of the day, if you're an economic power and the second largest economy in the world, and you're competing with the United States, you can't have economic power and then not have military power in order to protect your interests. So what I'm trying to say is, intentions aside, the United States and China just simply cannot trust each other with the way things are, and given their binary.
As someone would say, don't be these realists. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Kamran Bokhari speaking with us. I'm now joined by Andrew K.P. Leung, who's chairman of Andrew Leung International Consultants. Mr. Leung, thank you. The basic discussion has been with reference to Chinese military modernization. And there's also the issue of China's desire for trade and connectivity and investment and the rest of it. And we have the example of the RCEP. We have you were on my program and we talked about the EU-China trade deal. So what China should the world be looking at? The US seems to be looking at the China which is modernizing its military. Various other states, Pakistan included, looks at China as an economic powerhouse. So which China should we be looking at?
I think the perspectives are somewhat different. From the American perspective, that, of course, China's rise is almost natural as a result of its growing economic power. But then to the Americans, and it's across the aisle, the political aisle, I think both parties would agree. There is very little that both parties agree, but that is one thing that they definitely agree with one another, that China's rise is a threat to America dominated world order on several fronts. Firstly, of course, is the military in the South China Sea. That China seems to be pushing American forces out of the Asia Pacific. And that, of course, cannot be tolerated in the United States. Secondly, in terms of trade, China is perceived to be engaged in undesirable or problematic trade practices. For example, intellectual property protection, perceived forced intellectual transfer, again, perceived predatory trade practices, and so on and so forth. So I think that, again, both parties agree that, of course, China needs to be pushed back. And then thirdly, in terms of human rights, of course, China is not perfect in this. And of course, that runs counter to the values held dear in the West. And of course, the most important thing is that China is threatening to replace the United States leadership in the world, in the United Nations and elsewhere. So I think in all fronts, China is perceived to be a threat. But in terms of from China's perspective, China's rise is only a natural development. Naturally, all countries would like to improve their livelihood for their people, and China has been extremely successful in this. In less than 40 years, China has transformed its economy and its, in fact, the livelihood, and lifting out something like 800 million people out of poverty, and then making advances not only in terms of trade, but in terms of technology, in terms of the environment recently, and is a staunch supporter of the Paris Agreement. So I think that there is a conflict of rhetoric, if not mindset, as far as China's rise is concerned. And of course, military is only commensurate with the rise of your economic power and your connectivity. But to the United States and to other countries in the region, China's military modernization is perceived to be a threat. Now, this is, of course, is understandable in a way, but I think the danger is that if this kind of contradictory rhetoric is not carefully managed, things can get out of hand unexpectedly, and then there would be a very dangerous spiral, and then all the way down to unintended and uncontrollable consequences. Because don't forget that China is a nuclear power, and of course the United States is by far the largest and more powerful nuclear power.
Right. That kind of paints an interesting but also relatively grim picture. But let's hope, as you mentioned, that there are more areas of cooperation than there are areas of conflict. Thank you. That was Andrew, KP, Leung speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.